we often hear about calling out, and how we've got this call out culture, and something we talk about less, but more so now, is calling in. And to my mind, the act of calling in is really an empathic conversation, right? It's about, okay, well, you said this thing that perhaps I deeply disagree with, but instead of saying, well, I'm never going to talk to you again, or don't do that here, I'm actually going to come to you with an attitude of curiosity, and I'm going to ask you, well, that's really interesting. Where did that attitude come from? Or
welcome to season 16 of Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand that the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. Thanks so much for watching or listening. Enjoy the show. Welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. Today I'm joined by Shola Kaye, who is the author of 2 books and an international speaker on empathy at work, communication, and inclusive leadership. Shola is passionate about helping organizations create an atmosphere of respect and kindness. When a workplace is fully inclusive and welcoming, amazing things happen. People are transformed into leaders, teams and groups perform better, and everyone gains, according to Shola. Shola's work has appeared in a variety of magazines and in industry journals. She's a LinkedIn learning instructor, and her clients include the United Nations and Deloitte, and I'm so happy to have her today. Welcome to the show, Shola.
Thank you so much, Anita. It's an absolute joy to be here. I've been following you for a number of years, and so it's great to finally have the moment together.
And I was so happy when your TEDx was posted as a daily empathy post. And I thought, oh, this is a woman that I definitely want to speak to. And we were just chatting a little bit before we pressed record that we like each other's glasses and that we're both into sticks that have scent. So I feel like we're a bit girl crushing before we even hit record. But now let's get into it. So, what I'm really, since I mentioned your TEDx, why don't we start there? You have a really important talk about empathy in the workplace, and I'd love to know the backstory to what inspired you to get into that work in the first place.
Thank you so much for asking. And I'm from the UK, and I live in the UK now, but I started my career in the United States. And after studying, I've got a background in the sciences, and I studied those for a while. And then I went to work for a consulting firm in the States. And I really struggled at the beginning of my career. I think in part as an introvert, I was somebody who wasn't very comfortable with spontaneous situations. And as a consultant, obviously you're supposed to speak up and share your ideas. And I was somebody who was very quiet at work, very timid, didn't really make much of a contribution. And the first that I kind of realized that there's a bit of an empathy problem in the workplace was when my manager at the time didn't come to me and ask, well, how can we improve your performance? What can we do? But instead, he clearly was watching me for a while. And then I got summoned to the managing director, his office of the whole company. And then I was told I was being put on probation. And I remember, as somebody who'd always really worked hard and very conscientious, I just thought I'd completely screwed up my career. And luckily for me, there was a colleague who took pity on me and kind of came and gave me some support over a few weeks so that they never fired me. I ended up staying on. But I had that situation, and I had a very similar situation, this time in the UK, with a company in the UK once I moved back. And it just made me realize that there are a lot of people who are very underutilized in the workplace. There are a lot of people who people aren't asking questions, people are making assumptions. And of course, in the workplace, it's a fast-paced environment, there's a lot to do. So all too often, rather than taking that moment to sit down with somebody and ask them what's going on with them, we just assume, they're not capable, or they're lazy, or whatever it might be. So it was really sort of later on when I had the opportunity to do this TEDx, and I thought, well, what would be valuable for me in this moment to share with other people, or what thoughts and experiences have I had? And it just kind of fit with the theme to talk about, well, why we need more empathy in the workplace, and why we need to slow down a little bit, ask questions, just take the time to understand what's going on with the people next to us, not only from that interpersonal perspective. But of course, the workplace will benefit as well. So that's kind of how I got to talk about that topic, and then went on from there to do more in the area of empathy and communication.
And, a couple of things come up for me as you share that story. First, I'm reflecting on the metaphor that you use of the iceberg, right? We show up at work and we just see the tip of the iceberg, the little bit that gets to be shown in the workplace, and that it'd be nice if we could humanize the workplace where a little bit more of our structure ourselves could emerge. I wonder if you could share, because what the second thing that came up for me was the idea that if you're put on probation, whatever insecurities you had anyways, or any imposter syndrome you were feeling and carrying possibly, which we all have in various contexts to different degrees, like that must have just been very triggering. So how did you talk yourself off the ledge, when it comes to finding your center of gravity again, to feel confident and show up at work every day ready to perform without feeling the need to outperform or overcompensate?
Yeah, excellent question. No one's ever asked me that before. And when I think back to those years, to be honest, I don't think I had this right, I'm just going to put steps 1, 2, and 3 in place and I'll rebound. I was very lacking in confidence. I was quite insecure, worried about what would happen next. And I think I just took each day as it came and thought, well, what's the worst that can happen? Okay, if I do get fired, it's going to be very embarrassing and demotivating, but I'll still be here. There'll be something else around the corner. So I think it was just literally just struggling through, but sort of blundering on somehow. And as I mentioned, this colleague that I don't even know to this day if my manager asked this colleague to support me, or if this colleague, Alison, her name was, if she just did it, of her own volition. But when I think back, it wasn't even that she did much, right? We just got into work maybe half an hour earlier. I was having to do all this coding, and I'd never coded in my life, and all these things were going on. And she was just there, just there, providing some support. It wasn't particularly structured. But I just remember that after that period, her just being there was so helpful. And so I say to people, and especially when we're talking about, for example, with empathy and things like reflective listening and just repeating back to the person what they said or what they're feeling, all too often people don't feel that they're adding value. They've got to come up with something new, or and I use Alison's assistance, if you like, as an example of just your support, the listening, the being there can have all manner of help in giving someone a transformation. And so, as I say, I don't remember really what she did, but she was there and it made a difference.
I guess that's why you value kindness so much in the workplace, because it's undervalued, I think. People are so driven by a performance orientation, and yet if there was more kindness and empathy thread through the organizational culture, you'd have people getting along better at work. There's better trust, more openness. You assume the best of people. That's when innovation can really thrive, right? So if you're making the business case for empathy in the workplace, either at a sort of cultural level or empathic leadership, what do you say? So what is the business case for empathy at work?
Yeah, I mean, it's all those things that you're saying, right? So it's the understanding, so that people feel that they're able to share their ideas. It's giving people the ability to kind of do their best work because they can show up as themselves, because they feel understood, they feel seen, so they don't have to do those activities like covering or code switching, where they to feel accepted, they've got to put a lot of energy into hiding who they are, or into adding this extra veneer or layer over the top of themselves. And that takes, they call it the emotional tax, right? But that takes a lot of energy to do, right? So, and in my TEDx talk, I talk about, those old school deep sea divers who wear those big, heavy suits, and they're kind of stumbling around at the bottom of the ocean, and they're really slow. And we talk so much today about, agility and the need for speed and all the rest of it. But if people are having to put, 20% of their energy into, oh, can't say that, oh, got to dress this way, oh, got to put on this accent, oh, got to do, of course, that's going to stop people from really bringing all of themselves and all of their potential to work. So, even on those most basic levels, you can start to quantify that and look at, or people who even, talked about quiet quitting, right, a while back, all those sorts of behaviors that come about through people feeling whether they're resentful or unable to be themselves. So if on even a very kind of, lick your finger and put it in the wind, do a really rough business case, you can soon start to make a case for creating more kindness, more respect, more civility, more understanding in each and every workplace.
And what about the EDI conversation across the pond in the UK? I mean, obviously, on the heels of the murder of George Floyd, there was a huge racial reckoning in North America. I imagine it crossed the ocean. And EDI became a must-have within organizational corporate structures. And then there was a backlash, and then there's a retrenchment. So we actually are seeing budgets being cut from the EDI space. So I'm curious to know, what you think about all of that and the role of empathy within those conversations and how that's playing out in the UK.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because we're seeing the same, a lot of organizations were jumping in with both feet, or at least, claiming to, and now they're kind of backing away to some extent. But I think that there's still a core set of organizations who are really truly committed to this, and not doing it just for show. And where empathy comes into this is in the work that I do. Quite often people will come to me knowing that I do DEI or EDI, whatever you want to call it, alongside empathy. And they've said, well, we've had resistance. We want to implement some programs in our organization, but we've got people saying things like, we don't need that here because we don't have any problems, or the society at large doesn't have any problems with this. Why are we doing it? And so these organizations typically want to have an approach of empathy. And I talk about it as, sort of, it's like laying down the red carpet that people can then walk on and make these changes happen. And so I have a program which is called the Empathy to Equity Blueprint. And it starts out by creating an environment of empathy, talking about what is empathy, how do we have empathetic communication. And then once people feel that they can start to share who they are, start to feel a lot more understood, a lot of the resistance that they have to these sort of change initiatives, whether ED&I or other kinds of change initiative, that resistance often melts away because they feel that they are being listened to. And all too often we just think, well, if we bludgeon people into moving in a particular direction, or if we won't ask them, we'll just slip it in, and people then feel resentful and they will push back. So I tend to think that having this approach of empathy first, understanding, let people speak up, let people show the softer side of themselves without fear. Then after that, once you've got that foundation in place, you can build so much on top of it, and it will stick, rather than just sort of crumbling into dust because people are fighting against it.
Yeah, that's why I like the extension of the EDI or DEI to include the latest letter B of belonging. I really appreciate the inclusion piece and the sense of belonging, because I think that is core to who we are as humans. And when we feel included and we feel like we belong, if that is really felt, and it's not posturing or pretending or placating, but we really do feel included in a sense of belonging, then I think the other stuff works itself out. Would you tend to agree? Yeah.
Yeah, I agree, because I feel as though a lot of people say that belonging and inclusion are the same thing, and inclusion is something that the organization does, right? But the belonging is really what you feel. And I know with one of the clients that I kind of ran this program for, They, even though people at the beginning were saying, well, we don't need this, and what's this diversity nonsense, by the end of it, people were self-disclosing. There were people that said, well, I grew up in poverty, but I would never have shared that before. Or I have a multiracial background, but you wouldn't know it to look at me, and I would never have shared this with my colleagues before. So just the fact that people felt comfortable enough to start to really truly share who they were, I think it attests to the power of this work. And of course, then, going back to what we said before, once people can come in and say, yeah, well, this is who I am, there's a whole kind of a freedom that comes from that, which of course will impact the quality of their work, the quality of their interactions, and will have an impact on the company as well.
Which I think is so important for mental health too, because we spend the lion's share of our working life at work, right? I don't know how many hours, I think that it's 80,000 hours or something like that, but 5 days a week, 40 hours, 5 days a week, 40 hours a week, or 50 or 60 hours a week at work. And if we have kindness and a sense of belonging, that can only do good for our psyche and help with the mental health crisis that's happening in parallel. Now, your work sits at the intersection of empathy, inclusion, and communication. So why do you think that's a powerful combination for bringing about transformation in the workplace?
Well, I feel as though a lot of people understand how beneficial empathy is, and also the importance of inclusion, the importance of, DE&I, EDI. But I think what tends to happen is people are told these things are important, but they're not given that final piece, which is, okay, how do you convey that? How do you have an empathic conversation? How do you approach somebody, perhaps a colleague who is maybe making some negative comments, and you feel like you want to address that in a conversation? It could be a client, even, it could be a manager, but you don't feel you've got the tools. And so for me, because I came from a communication background to start with, I wouldn't feel comfortable going in and talking about inclusion or talking about even empathy without giving people some concrete strategies they can use. Okay, now Shola's gone now, but how are you going to have that conversation with your spouse or with your child or with that colleague? And so that's where I believe that communication frameworks become super, super important, so that people feel empowered. They feel that they've not only got the volition, but they actually have a tool to make things happen. So I try and always give people at least one or two very down-to-earth, step-by-step frameworks, so that they can walk away and say, yeah, I can do this.
Would you be willing to share one now?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So I mean, I'll share a couple with you. So we often hear about calling out, and how we've got this call out culture, and something we talk about less, but more so now, is calling in. And to my mind, the act of calling in is really an empathic conversation, right? It's about, okay, well, you said this thing that perhaps I deeply disagree with, but instead of saying, well, I'm never going to talk to you again, or don't do that here, I'm actually going to come to you with an attitude of curiosity, and I'm going to ask you, well, that's really interesting. Where did that attitude come from? Or you sound like you were a bit threatened by so-and-so's behavior. I'd really love to know how that came about. And so I give people a variety of different sentence starters, if you like, for calling in conversations. And some people feel very comfortable calling out because they're happy with conflict, or, to them, it doesn't give them a problem to call out. But there's a lot of people who, whether it's because of their culture, so I've done quite a bit of work with people from Asia, Philippines, Malaysia, etc. Some of my clients are from that way. And it's incredibly frowned upon to have those kind of calling out conversations. No one would do it. You just wouldn't do it. It's what we call a high power distance culture, where there's a great deal of distance between somebody who's perhaps in authority or more senior and somebody who's more junior. So they would just not even think of having a call out conversation. So for those individuals, any sort of strategies for calling in are incredibly useful, because it means they can then actually take part in these conversations without violating their cultural norms. So for those sorts of groups, I tend to give them plenty of sentence starters for calling calling in. And even sometimes we'll do practicing, of how to call in. So the calling in is one strategy. There's another framework I share, which is called the NET framework, NET. And NET
Shola, can I interrupt you for just a second? Because I just want to take a moment, a pause on that, because that was really powerful. I know that there's a really great TED Talk also about calling in, but I also am imagining, somebody learning that practice of calling in, how useful that would be in so many contexts, because the brain, as far as I know, it has the amygdala, which is the, otherwise known as the reptilian brain, that gets fired up subconsciously whenever we're feeling triggered. It's easy to feel triggered. We're all sort of have emotional landscapes. And it's the neocortex that allows us to do the higher order thinking, that calms us down if we engage it. But most of the time when we're feeling triggered, we are responding without that cool down, right? So the calling in is actually a practice, I feel, that's very helpful. So if you can gain self-awareness that you are triggered, then you could actually make the conscious decision, well, let me start to call in now, and let me start asking questions from curiosity so that I can lower the stress that's going on in my body because I was triggered before. Would you agree? Like, is that true?
Yeah, I think that's a really great angle, to be honest, because typically I will say to people, well, remember a couple of call-in phrases and a couple of call-outs so that you don't have to, you haven't got that fight flight thing where you go fuzzy and then it's like half an hour later, oh, I forgot what I was going to say, right? So just the idea of using that as a tool to regulate, I think is incredibly powerful. And it's not something I've I haven't taught it that way before, but I think that's really a fantastic observation, that we can use that to move away from the trigger, this sort of triggered behavior, to something a bit more measured and more thoughtful. Yeah, I love that.
And so what would be a couple of call-in type questions?
Would be something like, I'm really curious. So instead of, oh, we don't say that here, I'm really curious because what you've said implies that X, Y, and Z, or this group is threatening or whatever. So I'm really curious, what happened in your life to make you feel that way? Or that's a fascinating thing that you've just said. I'd love to know a bit more about that. So it's really just giving that person an opportunity to share more. And I've often said, when we talk about, for example, microaggressions or macroaggressions in some cases, quite often people know, well, not always, but we try and give people the benefit of the doubt. But you can tell, if you can get back to that person and say, oh, I'm curious, where did that come from? It'll be pretty obvious, I think, in how they respond, whether they say, oh, well, they're a bit defensive, or they actually go into that conversation with no defenses up, because for them it's just what they know and they're just being really honest about it.
Right. Beautiful. Okay, so that's a very, very powerful strategy, calling in. And then I interrupted you. You were going on to the second one. I know listeners and viewers are going to be like, Anita, don't forget.
So the second one is what I call the NET framework, NET. And so N stands for name it, E stands for empathize, and T stands for transform. So the name it could be, when we're talking about reflective listening, for example, somebody's sharing a situation that they're going through. So the N is really about calling back to them, whether using the same language or, paraphrasing, so that they feel heard. So that's the name it. And then the empathize with it is then saying, I understand what you're saying, or, I can understand why you feel that way, or whatever it might be. And then the T is for transform. And of course, we would love to think that we can help transform everyone's situation, but of course we can't, right? So transform could be something as simple as, what's next for you, or what are you planning to do now? Or it could be, if it's maybe a manager to a colleague, it could be, well, how can we support you? How can we move forward together? How can I support you? But it's really about, once the listening has been done, the empathy has been shown, then what's next? Because quite often when you're speaking with managers, they'll say, well, I've got this person, they just always come to me. They never solve their own problems. They're always grumbling and moaning and all the rest of it. So once you go to that T, the transform, it's really, you might say, well, what's next for you? And that's kind of encouraging them to then be in problem solving mode. So so that framework, I do a lot of work with tech companies and finance and so on, and people who perhaps don't naturally have those skills for conversation and communication. And they often find that having a little framework like that is incredibly helpful, because it just gives them those steps that they know they have to cycle through.
Absolutely. And I think it unearths not only individual agency, like, oh, I now let me think through what my next step is, and I have the capacity to figure it out, or in asking, how can we support you? If that's done sincerely and you get a sincere reply, then it's, then it's like, oh, I'm glad I have this information, because now I can meet that need, and then we can advance together. So it's a very coaching model where everybody has the answers. We just need to sort of surface them. So I love that. I love that. Okay, great. Was there a third that you want to share, or I'm going to ask my next question?
No, I think that's cool. I mean, another thing that I talk about, which is not so much a framework, but this idea of big talk and small talk, which I'm sure you've come across. So small talk might be things like, well, how are you today, Anita? Whereas a big talk might be, how's your week been? What's been going on for you this week? So it just starts to make things much more concrete in terms, rather than just very generic. And because obviously the more generic a question is, people just bat it off and say, oh yeah, I'm fine, or yeah, cool, move on. Versus, well, what's been going on for you this week? You're very unlikely to just bat that question off, right? You're going to answer it more fully. So this kind of big talk movement came apparently after the pandemic, because a lot of younger people, millennials, Gen Z, were lacking, they were missing out on those kind of day-to-day kind of conversational experiences that many had before the pandemic. And so to avoid making conversation too superficial and enable connection, this kind of big talk movement was born, just to make sure that people truly connected and understood each other. And I see that as an empathic conversation as well, because it's really digging into what's going on for that person and understanding.
I love that. I had not heard of it. So now I'm going to do some research, and we'll include anything I find in the show notes. Thank you so much for bringing that up. What kind of resistance is there? So let's talk about the role of empathy when it comes to working with resistance to change.
Yeah. I mean, I started doing this work in particular regarding, resistance to DE&I initiatives, but an organization I was working with wanted to kind of expand it to resistance to all sorts of change initiatives in the workplace. And obviously change initiatives might be, somebody who has to move to a different role because things are changing in their industry or the skills that they have. Or it could be, moving to a different market, or it could just be that, sort of downsizing, whatever. There's so much change that happens, right? And so the idea, again, is, rather than pushing that through or just saying, well, just grin and bear it, this is what's happening. If you can give people an opportunity to open up about how they're feeling about this change, then they are much more likely to eventually adopt the change kind of more willingly, if you like. And some people talk about, when we talk about resistance, we can say, well, we're going to overcome resistance, or we'll flatten the resistance. And instead, it's really about working with it, because we have to, we're humans, we're all different, we've all got different views, opinions, and so on. So the idea of working with it is really, I guess, more accepting of the fact that there will be resistance. Okay, how do we work with it, like putty in our hands, versus just quash the person into submission, basically.
It also makes me think of the work of, I think his name is Marty Linsky. If I'm wrong about that, I'll put in the show notes too. He's out of Harvard, and he talks about adaptive leadership. And he says that, if I'm getting it right, and this is based on memory, so I think I'm onto the right thread, but what memory comes to mind is, he's saying change is inevitable, okay? And when you're intentionally moving towards something new, so you're creating change, transformation in the workplace, whether it's to meet an opportunity in the marketplace, whether it's defensive, you have to create change. there will always be some people who will benefit from the change and always be some people who don't. And he said the key to adaptive leadership is to be intentional about the people who are not going to benefit from the change and to empathize with their needs, to really kind of surface those needs and find ways to let them see the light at the end of the tunnel, so that, you know, the change that could be painful or somehow disruptive for them, that's not ideal, that actually they get to the promised land and realize, okay, it will be better for me in the end for XYZ reason. So that is the goal of the adaptive leader. So anyways, I think what you're saying, it falls within that sort of general ecosystem.
That's such an interesting point, actually, because it's something that I've spoken about, and it's something I got from Lily Zheng, and they have written a couple of books about DE&I, but they talk about if you're making a decision that impacts various groups, then this is a time to say, well, if I were in this group, how would I feel about this change, right? What would I be wanting to happen instead? So it sounds very similar. You know, you're putting yourself in their shoes, so, and then thinking through, because quite often people don't, right? You know, they'll just, it won't hurt them that badly, and then they don't realize. So I think we're talking about something very similar there. Yeah.
Yeah, because we're humans and we have dynamic landscapes of emotional needs and insecurities and all of that. Now, you mentioned these authors, and so I know you're an author of 2 books. At the very beginning of our conversation, you talked about being an introvert, which, you know, I would never have guessed. I wouldn't know the story of sort of the challenge that you overcame initially in the early part of your career. And here you are writing about how to be an effective communicator, right? So I'd love for you to share a little bit about both books, if you wouldn't mind, Shola.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first book, I've got it here.
Great. DIVA at public speaking. I love it.
Yeah, so this is how to be a diva at public speaking, and DIVA is an acronym. And so D stands for dynamic, I stands for inspiring, so storytelling, V stands for being valuable, and A stands for being authentic. And the reason I wrote that book was because I'd always had this dream of being a professional singer. And after I had this kind of really shaky start in the corporate world, I just thought, well, I've completely screwed up my career. I may as well just go back to my kind of childhood dream and become a singer. So I ended up taking singing lessons, and for about a decade or so, I became a professional jazz and Motown singer. And then I just thought, well, you know, now I'm comfortable with crowds and so on. So, and there was something just pulling me to be a speaker. But whenever I'd speak to people about my career as a singer, they'd say, oh, wow, you've been a singer. And I say, well, hold on, it's not that different from being a speaker. And so I wrote the book just to kind of let people see that, you know, there's actually loads of benefits and pluses to speaking, and it's just as much fun as singing. And so that's sort of where that came from, that first book.
Love it. And so what's one little nugget of advice that you give to people who, let's say, are not comfortable getting up on a stage, you know, empathizing with that experience that you think might be valuable for folks?
Yeah, well, I try and make all my talks interactive. And the reason I do that is because when I first started doing full length keynotes, which, you know, an hour or however long, I always thought, gosh, I don't want everyone looking at me for a whole hour. How can I do this? And so I would build in all these interactive moments where people would turn to a partner or whatever it might be, or just sit and do some self-reflection. And I built those in primarily to just give myself some breathing space. But of course, people love it because everyone experiences your talk in a different way. And the more you allow people to kind of go in or to reflect, the more they're going to take away. And so I found that adding these interludes became very popular amongst people that would book me, and they would book me because of that. And so I always say to people, if you are putting a talk together, the more you can allow people to have their own experience of that, you know, through reflection and so on, the better it will be. And people will thank you. And you won't have been party to what they were thinking or what they were talking about with a partner, but they will thank you because there's so much more they can take away in terms of richness from your session. And so that's one thing I always say to people, to introverts or anybody who's worried about making a presentation.
Love it. Love it. So please hold up the book one more time, and then we'll talk about your second book.
you.
Diva,
So
how to be a diva. I love that. So
yeah.
the four letters are, tell me again.
Oh yeah, so D is for dynamic, so being lively and high energy. I is for inspiring, telling stories and bringing people in. V is for valuable, so obviously having the right content arranged in a way that's easy to absorb. And then A is for being your authentic self, so that you don't have to worry about, who you are on stage, because you just bring you to the moment.
Fantastic. Okay, how about your second book?
Great. I haven't talked about my books for donkey's years, actually. So it's quite So the second talk is called Big Talk, Small Talk, and everything in between, effective communication skills for all parts of your life. And this is kind of a kind of basic book, if you like, Communication 101. And it's really about, small talk scenarios, big talk scenarios, things like having to apologize to somebody, or what you would say to somebody in certain work situations. And so it's certainly not kind of a super kind of high level tome for anybody who wants to be an advanced communicator, but it's more of just some basic scenarios for somebody who's perhaps starting out at work, or transitioning from school to a career and so on.
Or even depending on the sector, you were mentioning that you work with people who are in finance or in coding and software. And it's not to say that they can't develop those skills. It's that they haven't been exposed to those skill development opportunities, right? So that sounds like a great book too. Oh, it's been really lovely to have a conversation with you, Shola. We've been on each other's radars for a long time, and voila, now I feel like I know you a little bit better and the important work that you do. If you'll indulge, I always end my podcasts with the same question, never knowing what will happen. But I find that the question tends to surface some really interesting stories that always leave me feeling sweet about the talk. And that is, the question is basically, when can you think of a time in your life when you were on the receiving end of empathy, and what that meant for you?
Mm. Well, I have a story just literally from last week, and I was in Marrakesh doing a talk, and I don't know if you've ever been there or seen, what it's like to cross the roads, but the roads are a little bit bonkers in that the cars just keep going. You have to sort of step out, and then if you're lucky, they'll slow down. It's very a bit hair-raising to cross the road. So I just delivered a talk, and I had to get a taxi back to my hotel. And I'd got my cash ready because Moroccan taxi drivers don't accept credit cards. And for some reason, I just couldn't find the cash anywhere. So I went down to the lobby of the hotel, and one of the, I guess a porter or a lobby attendant had hailed a taxi for me. And then I realized I've got no money. So the kindness, the empathy that he had for me was just recognizing that I had no chance crossing this road on my own, basically. So he very, very kindly sort of stepped away from the work that he was doing, and helped me to cross the road to one side. And I said, "Oh, okay, thank you. Go back to your work." And I said, "No, I'll stay with you." So he stayed with me while I took out the cash, and then helped me, stop the traffic, for me to go back the other way. And it's interesting because we have so many experiences day to day, and we're always looking for the new, or the different country, different this. But it's just those small acts of kindness and understanding that will stay with me more than the food that I ate on the trip, or how nice the hotel was, because it's just somebody who didn't have to do that, who was being very kind and empathetic. So it's a small story, but for me, it had an impact.
And that allows me to end on the note of, we all have the opportunity every day to turn up the volume of empathy in our lives. It feels good to do it, so why not, right?
There we go. There we go. Absolutely.
Shola, I know it's 5 hours later for you, so you're ending your day shortly in the UK. I want to thank you so much for spending an hour chit-chatting about your work. It's lovely to meet you. I think you're doing great work, and I hope one day we get the chance to meet in person.
Wonderful. It's been a real joy to be with you today, Anita. And I'd like to say that you're obviously very empathetic as well. because I was grumbling at the beginning that I'm not really that comfortable doing podcasts, and I felt super relaxed and at ease with you. So I want to thank you for your own empathy.
Oh, beautiful. Shining back at you. Folks who are listening and watching, thank you so much, and we'll see you next week at Purposeful Empathy.
Thank you so much for watching or listening to another episode of Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand that the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. Please now consider subscribing or buying a copy of Purposeful Empathy. Thanks again. Have a great day.